Can you believe that history, vast and sprawling as it is, pivoted entirely on the shoulders of a single, infuriated man? This is not the sanitized classroom lecture you once endured. This is the chronicle of the seismic event, the human catastrophe no one saw coming. The rise of a demigod who dared to crown himself, shatter Europe, and redefine the meaning of human ambition. Forget the small island of Corsica where he was born. Imagine instead a tiny, overlooked laboratory where the perfect engine of war was silently being built, fueled by resentment and a genius that bordered on the supernatural. In the late 1780s, the entire structure of the Western world was a vast, fragile crystal palace built on ancient privilege and outdated monarchies, humming with the low frequency of approaching doom. Nobody, absolutely nobody in the glittering halls of Versailles or the cold academies of Vienna was looking south, towards the dusty, volatile Mediterranean, towards the birthplace of the man who would tear that palace down, piece by violent piece. He wasn't rich, he wasn't well-connected. He was a statistical anomaly, armed only with a ferocious, near-pathological drive to prove that he was smarter, faster, and simply more necessary than everyone else around him. He devoured history and mathematics, not for knowledge, but for blueprints. He treated every book as a manual on how to conquer the men who wrote it, training his mind into a weaponized instrument of strategy and ruthless efficiency. While the marquises debated philosophy in Paris salons, young Napoleon was in Brienne, eating scraps and nursing a simmering rage against the entire established order, a rage that would eventually explode across 2 continents. His early life was a constant stream of humiliation and poverty, the kind of crushing experience that either breaks a man entirely or forges him into unbreakable steel. It forged steel. Every insult lobbed at the foreigner became another layer of armor. Every lonely night spent studying military doctrine became another piece in the inevitable, devastating puzzle of his future empire. He saw the world not as a place of rules, but as an enormous, badly managed chessboard just waiting for a true genius to step up and move the critical pieces. Then came the thunderclap, the earth-shattering moment that history had been holding its breath for, the French Revolution. This wasn't just a political upheaval, it was a cosmic disruption, a vortex that swallowed the weak and spat out the monstrously ambitious. It was the moment that the forgotten, angry artillery officer realized his time had come, that the rules were finally being burned to ashes. The revolution didn't just create opportunity, it created chaos. And chaos is the only true environment where a man like Napoleon can ascend from obscurity to absolute command in the blink of an eye. He understood power fundamentally, viscerally, that it flows not from birthright or tradition, but from the brutal, swift application of force and psychological dominance. The world was about to witness the ultimate example of preparation meeting opportunity, amplified by a genius so profound it terrified even his closest allies. His mind worked faster than light, processing variables, troop movements, and supply lines with the speed of a supercomputer, all while maintaining the cold, distant stare of a predator assessing its prey. His rise would be so swift, so blindingly aggressive, that by the time Europe realized they weren't fighting the French Republic anymore, but the single will of this astonishing individual, it would already be too late. This is where the world changed forever, where the age of kings died and the age of the tyrant began. The clock is ticking, the French armies are disorganized, and somewhere in the smoky haze of the revolutionary fervor, the most dangerous man in history is calculating his first move. Prepare yourself, because the cannon fire is about to begin, and the world is about to meet the ultimate master of chaos. The world had just been introduced to the ultimate master of chaos, but before he could command empires, he had to survive the impossible crucible of his own birth and childhood. The tremor that would eventually rock Europe began not in the gilded halls of Versailles, but on August 15, 1769, on the sun-baked, brutally rebellious island of Corsica. He was born Napoleon Bonaparte, a name that carried the heavy, thick accent of Italy, a name that spoke of an identity fiercely detached from the French crown that had conquered his homeland just months before his arrival. This wasn't a French child. This was a cultural anomaly, a low-ranking noble in a territory soaked in centuries of vendetta and revolutionary fervor. The sons of the Parisian aristocracy, dripping in privilege and powdered arrogance, instantly marked him as prey. They mocked the way he spoke. They laughed at his strange, un-French name. They sneered at the provincial simplicity of his clothes and the supposed savagery of his island heritage. Every single taunt, every cruel joke, every public humiliation about his family's lack of wealth or his own perceived inferiority was not forgotten or dismissed. It was meticulously catalogued, recorded, and stored in the dark, granite vault of his memory, fueling a subterranean rage that would eventually power the destruction of their world. He devoured every treatise on artillery science, every meticulous account of Hannibal and Alexander the Great, finding solace and power in the absolute logic of geometry and the brutal realities of ancient warfare, becoming a statistical anomaly, a genius forged entirely by the hammer blows of social rejection. He read Plutarch so many times that the heroes of antiquity became more real to him than his own classmates. He focused his entire, terrifying intellect onto the science of artillery, the only branch of the military at the time that was truly meritocratic, where lineage meant nothing and accurate calculation meant everything. Artillery was the science of delivering controlled, catastrophic destruction. It was the ultimate, undeniable power to change the landscape of a battle instantly, and Napoleon saw it as his ticket out of poverty and his ultimate tool of geopolitical control. For the next decade, from 1785 onward, Napoleon was nothing more than an intellectual ghost trapped within the vast, stagnant, and decaying machinery of the Bourbon monarchy. He was wretchedly poor, often skipping meals, patching his increasingly threadbare uniforms, living a life of utter, soul-crushing intellectual frustration in sleepy, provincial garrisons like Valence and Auxonne. He was a tactical supernova waiting for the absolute vacuum of space, a hyper-efficient, 1,000% capacity tactical mind operating within a broken system that demanded only 10% effort and maximum conformity. He spent his time writing angry, miserable little pamphlets, attempting to draft a history of Corsica and dreaming desperately of revolution, anything to escape the suffocating mediocrity of peacetime army service that was slowly consuming his genius. He wasn't just waiting for the inevitable storm to break over France. He was intellectually primed to seize it, viewing the accelerating decay of the monarchy not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as a colossal, unprecedented, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that only a man of absolute desperation and supreme skill could exploit. He was reading the most incendiary works of Rousseau and Voltaire, soaking up the radical, dangerous ideas that were boiling just beneath the powdered, ridiculous surface of France, realizing that the old order was not just weak, it was ripe for harvesting. Imagine the future emperor of Europe, stripped of everything, penniless, wandering the streets of Marseille and Paris, simply waiting. He was an officer without a command, a strategist without a battle, surviving on meager pay, spending his time writing political pamphlets, aligning himself with the most radical, bloodthirsty faction of the revolution, the Jacobins, because he understood that in a revolution defined by beheadings, you always follow the man holding the sharpest blade. He wasn't charming or beloved. He was simply the most devastatingly efficient mind in the military bureaucracy. His promotions during this period were not for heroism, but for his detailed, cold-blooded technical expertise in artillery deployment. The Republic needed competence, not politics, because every single crowned head in Europe was now marching toward France to choke the revolution in its cradle. His moment was waiting in the blistering heat of late 1793 at a critical port city that had committed the ultimate revolutionary sin, Toulon. This crucial harbor had opened its arms to the combined fleets of Britain and Spain, the naval superpowers of the world. It was a dagger pointed straight at the heart of the Republic, and the revolutionary army surrounding it was a paralyzed, disorganized mess of incompetent officers. During the climax of the fight, he was struck by a British bayonet thrust deep into his thigh, a wound that almost claimed his life and left a severe scar he would carry forever. But the pain only seemed to magnify his focus. The assault succeeded. The fort fell. The high ground was secure. As the sun rose, the British admiral looked out and saw the impossible. French revolutionary cannons now pointing directly down at his vulnerable fleet. The harbor was untenable. The order for immediate, panic-stricken evacuation was given. Toulon had fallen, not to massed infantry, but to the cold, undeniable genius of an artilleryman who saw the angle that no one else did. He was no longer just a talented officer. He was a historical force, forged in the heat of revolutionary fire. The path to ultimate power was suddenly, violently, and mathematically clear. Europe had just witnessed the birth of a legend, and it would spend the next 2 decades trying desperately and failing miserably to put him back in the bottle. They needed him gone, not retired, but dispatched to a place where ambition usually went to die, the army of Italy. This was the forgotten front, a starving, ragged collection of soldiers fighting the powerful Habsburg Austrians and the Kingdom of Sardinia. It was meant to be a political exile disguised as a command, a slow, agonizing descent into obscurity where the logistical nightmares and lack of funding would surely crush his ambition, leaving him just another footnote in the revolution's bloody ledger. The Directory believed they were sending him to failure. Fate knew better. When Napoleon arrived in Nice in March 1796, what he found was not an army, but a horror show draped in mud and despair. Their pay was years overdue, their uniforms were rags, and their boots were literally falling off their feet. The men were deserting in droves, sustained only by the revolutionary fervor that was rapidly cooling under the weight of hunger and sheer tactical impossibility. He stared down the barrel of an army of 30,000 ghosts, facing combined enemy forces nearly twice their size, well-fed and impeccably supplied. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches. He wasn't promising victory. He was promising immediate, tangible plunder and a radical transformation of their miserable lives. It was a raw, brutal, and profoundly honest appeal to the revolutionary greed and courage that still simmered beneath their rags. The effect was instantaneous, turning a demoralized rabble into a focused, lethal predator pack ready to eat the heart out of Italy. What followed was not merely a military campaign, but a historical earthquake known to military scholars as the Lightning War, long before the 20th century dared coin the term. Napoleon invented speed as a weapon. He used the maneuver on the interior lines, a tactical masterpiece where he kept his forces centrally located, allowing him to strike the larger, slower, more cumbersome Austrian and Sardinian armies piecemeal, defeating them separately before they could coordinate. The enemy generals were still debating their maps and waiting for supply wagons, while Napoleon's starving, lightning-fast troops were already storming their rear flanks. He wasn't just fighting. He was perpetually 1 week ahead of reality itself, moving his infantry 30 miles a day over treacherous terrain. In 11 days, 11 brutal, impossible days, he shattered the Sardinian army. The enemy commander, General Colley, surrendered, forced to sign the humiliating armistice of Cherasco, which ceded critical territory and fortresses to France. This was the moment the legend truly crystallized. His soldiers stopped calling him general and started calling him the petit corporal, the little corporal, a term of intense affection and awe for his personal, reckless, almost suicidal bravery. He had crossed the line from commander to demigod. He imposed massive indemnities on cities like Milan and Venice, extracting millions of francs, priceless works of art, and essential supplies. He was building his own treasury, his own political base, and crucially, his own propaganda machine. He founded 2 newspapers specifically for his army and for the territories he controlled, controlling the narrative of his own invincibility with ruthless precision. The people of France were no longer reading about the Directory, they were reading about the miracles of Bonaparte. Paris watched in horror as their exiled general became a sovereign power unto himself, issuing treaties, dictating borders, and commanding alliances without their input. When they dared to suggest sending another general to share command, Napoleon's reply was a cold, mathematical threat. "I have conducted the campaign without consulting anyone," he wrote back. "I could not do any good with another person. I will not give up the command." The message was violent, clear, and delivered with the weight of hundreds of millions of francs and the loyalty of 40,000 battle-hardened veterans. This was no longer the servant of the revolution. This was the master of his own terrifying history. a historical comet burning so bright that it threatened to incinerate the very Republican ideals that had launched him. They had sent him to die of starvation. Instead, he returned, dripping in gold, draped in invincible glory, and carrying the blueprints for an empire in his saddlebag. The stage was set for the impossible coup d'état that would shatter the Republic forever, transforming France's revolutionary chaos into a single, terrifying will. The plan was to use Article 102 of the Constitution, which allowed the legislature to relocate outside Paris if the capital faced imminent danger. By fabricating a massive Jacobin threat, the conspirators would force the two legislative bodies, the Council of Ancients and the Council of 500, to move to the Château of St. Cloud, just outside the city walls. The power was transferred not in a violent street battle, but through a piece of paper signed in a dusty room before breakfast. Napoleon, surrounded by his most loyal officers, Murat, Lens, Berthier, rode out from the Tuileries Palace, now legally controlling the military force necessary to shatter the Republic. The next day, 19 Brumaire, the scene shifted to the magnificent but confined halls of St. Cloud. Here, the political maneuvering began to unravel. The Council of Ancients, upon realizing they had been tricked, grew restless. The Council of 500, dominated by fiercely anti-royalist, pro-Republican deputies, was outright hostile, shouting treasonous accusations before the general even entered the room. But the true crisis unfolded when he entered the Council of 500, a legislative chamber filled with men who saw him not as a savior, but as a potential dictator, a new Caesar. They screamed, they charged, "Down with the dictator! Outlaw him! Outlaw him!" The roar was deafening. The deputies, specifically the furious Jacobin faction, swarmed him, grabbing his collar, shoving him, threatening to tear him to pieces right there on the floor. The general, who faced cannon fire without blinking, recoiled, stuttering, utterly undone by the raw physical confrontation and the shock of being called a criminal. But the stage was not yet done with him. Inside the hostile chamber, presiding over the Council of 500, sat Napoleon's younger brother, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was an incredibly skillful orator and a shrewd politician, the quiet, intellectual counterbalance to his brother's brutal military force. Protected by a squad of grenadiers, Napoleon stormed out of the chamber and into the courtyard where the troops were waiting. He mounted a horse, drew his sword, and delivered a speech so incendiary, so perfect for the moment, that it instantly turned the tide. The soldiers marched into the legislative hall accompanied by the rhythmic beat of drums, a terrifying, unstoppable intrusion of military force into the sanctuary of civilian government. The deputies of the Council of 500, horrified, scattered. Many literally jumped out of the windows to escape the charge, fleeing across the lawns of St. Cloud, their revolutionary careers ended by the sight of steel. On December 2, 1804, in the hallowed halls of Notre Dame, with Pope Pius VII summoned merely as a terrified witness, Napoleon performed the ultimate act of self-legitimization, transforming the revolutionary chaos into a terrifyingly centralized, hereditary imperial power. He was no longer a man. He was the physical manifestation of destiny, draped in ermine, forcing Europe to bow or break. Every king, Kaiser, and Tsar, watching from their gilded cages, understood the terrifying message. The age of divine right was dead, replaced by the age of meritocracy backed by cannon fire. Legitimacy was now a weapon wielded by the victor. His greatest non-military weapon, the Code Civil, the Napoleonic Code, standardized law, codified property rights, and cemented the revolutionary ideals of equality before the law, binding the disparate regions of France into one mercilessly efficient whole. He was creating the logistical engine required to feed, supply, and march 1 million men across the continent indefinitely. Austria, still reeling from past defeats and desperate to reclaim influence, was the first to answer the call, joined by the vast, icy might of Russia under the young and passionately anti-French Tsar Alexander I. The clock was ticking, and the armies were mobilizing. Napoleon knew this collision was inevitable, but his heart still pulsed with the impossible dream of invading England. He massed the immense Armée des Côtes de l'Océan, the Army of the Ocean Coasts, at Boulogne, training them ruthlessly for the impossible Channel crossing. He needed control of the seas for just 6 hours. That was the mathematical equation of the world's fate. But Britain's defense, the Royal Navy, led by the peerless Lord Nelson, was an unbreachable, vigilant wall of oak and cannon fire. The pressure was agonizing. As Napoleon fixated on the white cliffs of Dover, the coalition clock was ticking faster than his own. Intelligence confirmed the nightmare scenario. The Austrians and Russians were already flooding into the vulnerable German satellite states, believing Napoleon was tied up waiting for favorable winds. This is the moment where Napoleon's genius transforms from political maneuvering to pure, terrifying operational speed. In August 1805, the invasion plans for England were immediately scrapped, tossed into the fire pit of strategic necessity. The 200,000 men waiting on the French coast, the greatest fighting force in the world, soon to be known forever as the Grande Armée, were ordered to turn east. This was not a retreat. It was a forced march into history, an unprecedented logistical feat known as the Boulogne Camp. In 40 days, this immense army, previously concentrated for a naval war, marched 500 miles across Europe, traversing the Rhine and heading deep into Bavarian territory. The speed was dizzying, a blur across the map of 19th-century warfare. The Austrians, led by General Mack von Leiberich, were confidently marching toward the Rhine, assuming they had months before the slow French war machine could reach them. They were wrong, terribly wrong. Napoleon struck with the precision of a celestial body colliding with Earth. His corps, moving independently but converging perfectly under the centralized command structure, executed a massive flanking maneuver that completely encircled Mack's main force near the city of Ulm. This was not a battle. It was a surgical strangulation, known to history as the Ulm Campaign. Mack found himself entirely cut off, surrounded by the enemy he believed was still languishing on the shores of the Atlantic. The psychological impact broke the Austrian resolve before a single major engagement could be fought. On October 20, 1805, General Mack surrendered his entire army, nearly 30,000 men, without a major fight. They hadn't been defeated. They had been outmaneuvered by speed, deception, and Napoleon's relentless pace.